The forge exploded in a wall of fire and collapsing iron at 11:30 on a Thursday night in January of 1884, and Jennie Hadley was the only one who saw it happen. She was standing 40 feet away, arms crossed against the killing cold, watching the structure she had spent 3 years building groan and buckle under the weight of ice that had crept up the support beams during the worst freeze Caldwell, Kansas had seen in a decade. The temperature had dropped to -14 degrees the night before, and the moisture inside the limestone foundation had expanded and cracked the base columns in ways she had not anticipated when she laid them herself in the autumn of 1881. The iron walls bellowed outward. The central chimney, which she had poured and shaped with her own hands from salvaged railroad iron, shrieked a sound like a dying animal, and then the whole structure caved inward with a crash that shook snow from the cottonwood trees a quarter-mile away. She did not scream. She did not weep. She stood in the snow with her jaw set and her dark eyes burning, and she watched the forge she had built from nothing collapse into a heap of twisted metal and broken stone. Then she turned around, walked 15 feet to the supply shed, and started pulling out her tools. That was Jennie Hadley. That was who she had always been. And that was the exact moment that Oliver Barker, Marshal of Caldwell, came riding hard around the corner of Main Street on his roan gelding, having heard the collapse from 3 blocks away, and expecting to find a catastrophe that needed managing. What he found instead was a woman in a leather apron and heavy work gloves already dragging a timber brace through the snow, her breath coming in great white clouds in the lantern light, her expression carrying not one single trace of despair. He pulled his horse up short and stared. She did not look at him. "You going to help?" she said, "or are you just going to sit up there on that horse and get frostbitten?" He had been marshal for 2 years. He had faced down outlaws, talked 3 men out of drawing on him, and once walked alone into a burning barn to pull out a child. He was not a man who was easily thrown off balance, but he had never seen anything like Jennie Hadley pulling structural timber through a blizzard at midnight with the calm certainty of someone who had already planned exactly what needed to happen next. He swung down from the saddle without a word and tied the roan to the fence post. And that was how it started. But to understand how it ended, you have to go back 6 weeks, to the day Jennie Hadley arrived in Caldwell with a wagon full of ironworking equipment, a letter of introduction to no one in particular, and a reputation that had preceded her by 100 miles. It was the 2nd week of December, 1883, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, was sitting on the edge of something complicated. The cattle drives that had made the town prosperous through the late 1870s were slowing down. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad had already come through, which was both a blessing and a curse. It had brought settlers and commerce, but it had also brought a certain kind of ambition that turned neighbor against neighbor over contracts and land claims. The town needed a blacksmith. The previous one, a man named Doyle, had died of pneumonia in October, leaving behind an anvil, a broken bellows, and a forge that was structurally compromised even before Jennie got there. She was 28 years old. She had been trained by her father, Henry Hadley, who had run a forge in Independence, Missouri since before the war. Henry Hadley had been a particular kind of man, one who had watched every child he had with a clear eye and taught them what they showed aptitude for, regardless of what society said that aptitude ought to be. Jennie had been his only child who truly understood iron. Her older brothers could swing a hammer, but they could not feel what the metal needed the way Jennie could. By the time she was 14, she was doing finish work. By the time she was 20, she was doing structural iron work that Henry admitted was better than his own. When Henry died in 1882, he left her the tools and the knowledge and the right to carry the Hadley name into her work. Her brothers inherited the land. There was no bitterness in it. That was simply how the law worked in Missouri in 1882. And Jennie had known since she was a child that her path was going to require her to forge something of her own, in every sense of the word. She had worked in 2 towns before Caldwell. The first was Dodge City, where she had lasted 8 months before the cattle operations that had hired her decided that a woman doing ironwork made the cowboys uncomfortable and let her go. The second was a small settlement near Wichita where she had operated independently for over a year, doing excellent work, until the town simply did not grow fast enough to sustain a smithy of any size. Caldwell was different. Caldwell was a border town, which meant it was rough and complicated and full of competing interests, and it was exactly the kind of place where a person who did not fit into any comfortable category could carve out a place for themselves through sheer competence. She had heard about the vacancy from a merchant who passed through Wichita in November, and she had made her decision in less than a day. She loaded her wagon, said her goodbyes to the handful of people in Wichita who had treated her fairly, and drove south into the cold. She arrived on a Wednesday morning when frost was thick on the boardwalks, and the sky had the particular low gray color that meant serious weather was building somewhere to the north. The first person who gave her trouble was a man named Franklin Creed, who ran the general merchandise store and fancied himself a civic authority despite holding no official position whatsoever. He was standing outside his store when Jennie's wagon rolled past, and he watched it with narrowed eyes, then came out into the street. "You lost, ma'am," he called. "No," Jennie said without slowing the wagon. "You're heading toward the blacksmith lot, Old Doyle's place." "I know where I'm heading." Creed took a few quick steps to keep up with the wagon. He was a heavy-set man with a walrus mustache and the particular kind of confidence that came from 20 years of people not challenging him. That property's being considered by several serious buyers. Jennie pulled the wagon to a stop and looked at him with the calm, level gaze that those who knew her would have recognized as a warning sign. "I have a signed lease agreement with the property owner, Mr. Abel Marsh, for a period of 2 years with option to purchase. I signed it 3 weeks ago by post." She reached into her coat and produced a folded document. "Would you like to see it?" Creed looked at the document, then at her, then at the wagon loaded with iron and tools. Something flickered in his face, not quite respect, but the beginning of recalculation. "You're a smithy," he said, and his tone had gone from dismissive to something more carefully neutral. "I'm a blacksmith," she said, "and an ironworker. I do structural metalwork, horseshoeing, tool repair, agricultural equipment, decorative ironwork, and custom forging. I also have 5 years of direct experience with railroad iron." She folded the document and put it back in her coat. "Is there anything else I can clarify, or would you like to get out of my way so I can unload?" She drove past him without waiting for an answer. The second person she met in Caldwell was considerably more pleasant. Her name was Ruth Calloway, who ran the boarding house, and she was a compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a direct manner that Jennie appreciated immediately. Ruth was on her porch when Jennie drove past, and instead of asking questions or giving trouble, she simply called out, "You the new smith?" "Yes," Jennie said. "Come for supper tonight if you want a decent meal before you start unpacking. I charge fair." That was the beginning of a friendship that would sustain Jennie through the harder months to come. She spent the first 2 weeks doing exactly what she said she would. She assessed the existing forge, which was genuinely bad. Doyle had been a competent smith but a careless builder, and the structure had problems in the foundation and the chimney draw that explained some of his respiratory difficulties in his final months. She drew up plans for the repair and reinforcement work she would need to do, ordered materials through the merchant she was already beginning to suspect was Franklin Creed's nephew by the way he looked at her invoices, and began the slow, hard work of making the place functional. She was working outside the forge on a Saturday afternoon, fitting a new hinge plate she had made from salvaged iron, when she heard boots on the frozen ground behind her. She did not startle. She had developed the habit of paying attention to sounds around her in the years she had worked in places where not everyone was comfortable with what she was. "Miss Hadley," she turned. The man standing behind her was tall, well over 6 feet, with the particular kind of build that came from genuine physical labor rather than performance. He was wearing a heavy canvas coat and a dark hat with snow on the brim, and on his vest she could see the tin star of a marshal's badge. He was not old, perhaps 31, with dark brown hair under the hat and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same limestone as half the buildings in Caldwell. His eyes were gray, the clear, steady gray of early morning sky, and they were looking at her with straightforward attention rather than the assessment or the skepticism she usually got from men in positions of authority. "That's me," she said. "Oliver Barker. I'm the marshal." He put out his hand and she shook it, which seemed to neither surprise nor unsettle him. "I wanted to introduce myself and let you know that if you have any trouble settling in, my office is 2 blocks north." "I appreciate that," she said and turned back to the hinge plate. There was a pause. Most men, she had learned, would either leave at that point or start asking questions designed to establish that they knew more about ironwork than she did. Oliver Barker did neither. "That hinge," he said after a moment. "The plate gauge looks heavier than standard for a door that size." She glanced at him. "It does," she said. "Why?" It was a direct question, not a challenge. She considered him for a moment, then answered directly. "Because the door frame on this building is settling toward the northeast. I'm compensating with extra weight on the south hinge so the door hangs true. Standard gauge would have it dragging the threshold within 6 months." He looked at the door frame, then at the hinge, then at her. "You figured that out just by looking at it, and by feeling the frame with my hands, and by watching which way the old hinge wore. The wear pattern tells you the history of what a structure has been doing." He was quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable silence of a man who didn't know what to say, but the comfortable silence of a man who was thinking about what he just heard. "That's smart," he said, and his tone was perfectly straightforward, not patronizing, not surprised in an insulting way, just genuine acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said. He tipped his hat. "If you need anything, Miss Hadley." He walked away, and she watched him go for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before turning back to her work. Franklin Creed, as it turned out, was not simply a civic busybody. He was a man with a specific plan, and Jennie's presence in Caldwell was inconvenient to it. The plan involved a man named Silas Creed, Franklin's younger brother, who had been angling to buy the blacksmith property and consolidate it with his farm supply operation to create a kind of monopoly on agricultural services in the Caldwell area. The arrival of a legitimate smithy with a legal lease and obvious professional competence was, from Silas Creed's perspective, a direct threat to that plan. Jennie became aware of the threat gradually, through a series of small incidents. 2 merchants who had expressed interest in commissioning ironwork from her suddenly became unavailable. A load of coal she had ordered for the forge arrived short by a third, and the freight company claimed it had been delivered as ordered. The young man she had been negotiating with to do some basic assistant work, nothing skilled, just moving materials and working the bellows, came to tell her apologetically that he'd been offered twice the money to work at the Creed farm supply. She did not panic. She tracked each incident carefully, noted the pattern, and filed the information away. She also began doing something she had learned was the single most effective counter to this kind of hidden motive and deliberate obstruction. She did exceptional work. She repaired the broken coupling on the Callaway boarding house well pump. The previous smith had patched it 3 times and it kept failing. She diagnosed the real problem, which was a stress fracture in the housing that the patching had been hiding, made a new housing from scratch, and had the pump running properly within an afternoon. Ruth Callaway told everyone she knew. She repaired the wheel rims on the post rider's wagon, which had been causing problems for months. She refitted the hardware on the Caldwell schoolhouse doors, which had been hanging wrong since they were first installed. She did 2 commissioned pieces of decorative ironwork, a gate hinge set and a window grill, for a homesteader who had just built a new house, and she did them with the kind of craftsmanship that made people stop and look. By the end of her third week in Caldwell, she had more work than she could easily manage alone, and people were starting to talk about her in the way she had learned meant she was being accepted, with the specific kind of admiring complaint that frontier communities reserved for people who were genuinely indispensable. "That Hadley woman charges fair, but she doesn't rush," was the general verdict. "But her work doesn't break so." Oliver Barker came by the forge again in the third week, this time with a practical need rather than an introduction. His horse had thrown a shoe on a rocky stretch of road south of town, and he had ridden in carefully and needed the work done. She examined the hoof before she did anything else, which he watched with interest. "You're checking for damage," he said. "You said you rode in on rocky ground. If he's been hitting that hoof wrong, the shoe isn't your only problem." She ran her hands carefully around the hoof wall and the frog, watching the horse's responses. "He's fine. The ground was cold enough to keep the hoof firm. But the old shoe was fitted too tight here." She indicated the heel, which means it would have started causing discomfort within another month anyway. "Doyle fitted that shoe," Oliver said. "Doyle did a lot of things that were almost right." She said it without particular criticism, just as a statement of professional observation. She selected the appropriate stock, measured it against the hoof, and went to the forge. Oliver Barker stayed and watched her work. He did not talk while she worked, which she appreciated. She disliked the men who narrated everything she was doing as if they were explaining it to her. He simply watched, and she was aware of his eyes on her with a steadiness that was different from the staring she sometimes got. He was genuinely watching how she did what she did. When she drew the heated iron from the forge and began shaping it over the horn of the anvil with controlled, precise hammer strokes, she saw from the corner of her eye that he had come forward slightly, leaning against the doorframe of the forge with his arms crossed, intent. She finished the shoe, quenched it, and fitted it with the careful attention she gave to all her work, checking the seat, the nail angles, the bray cover point, the way the heel would bear the horse's weight in motion. When she put the gelding's hoof down and stepped back, she was satisfied. Oliver Barker paid her, which he did without making it into an occasion, and then he said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. Where did you learn all of this?" "My father," she said, "and then I kept learning on my own. Iron teaches you things if you're willing to listen to it." He looked at her with those clear gray eyes. "You talk about iron like it's a living thing. It behaves like one. It has moods. It responds differently depending on how you approach it. You have to learn to work with what it wants to do, not just force it into shapes." She began cleaning up her tools, which was her usual signal that a conversation was concluding. "It's not so different from horses, I imagine." He smiled at that, a real smile, not a performed one. It changed his face considerably, making him look younger and less weathered, and she registered it as the kind of smile that was worth paying attention to. "That's a fair comparison," he said. He came back the following week with a small commission, a set of gate latches for a property he was responsible for maintaining as part of his marshal duties, a widowed woman's land that he was apparently keeping an eye on informally. Jennie made the latches and added a small feature. He hadn't asked for a one-handed operation design that would let an older person or someone carrying something open the gate without setting anything down. When he picked them up and she showed him the modification, he stood for a long moment just looking at the latch, working it with one hand. Then he looked at her. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "She's going to be using those latches every day for years," Jennie said. "It cost me 10 minutes. Why wouldn't I?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, something layered and complicated in it, and then he paid her for the work and left. The Creed trouble escalated in the fourth week, and this time it moved from inconvenience into something with sharper edges. She arrived at the forge one morning to find that the coal storage had been broken into during the night. Nothing was stolen, but the coal had been mixed with wood ash and scrap material that would ruin the burn quality and potentially damage the forge if she used it without noticing. She noticed. She also noticed the particular way the lock on the storage door had been forced, not broken, but worked with a tool, the kind of job that took time and knowledge of locks. She went to Oliver Barker's office. He was at his desk when she came in, going over what looked like land records. He looked up immediately when she entered, and something in her expression made him set the papers down. She told him what she had found, calmly and precisely, including her observations about the lock. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked two clarifying questions: what time she had left the forge the previous evening, and whether anyone had seen anything unusual near the storage area. Then he said, "I want to come look at it." "That's why I'm here," she said. He came and he looked at the lock and the storage with the same careful, methodical attention she had given it, and then he looked at the adulterated coal supply and shook his head slightly. "This isn't random vandalism," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's targeted. Someone who knows something about coal quality and what would damage a forge. And about locks," he looked at her. "You have ideas about who?" "I have observations," she said carefully. "I don't have evidence yet, but I've noticed a pattern to the difficulties I've had since I arrived here, and they all seem to root back in the same general direction." "Creed," he said. She looked at him. "You know. Franklin Creed has been trying to consolidate every service business in this town that doesn't have a strong, independent owner for 2 years. He's done it quietly and he's careful." Oliver's jaw was tight. "The widowed woman whose latches you made, he's been putting pressure on her to sell her land for 8 months. I've been watching him, but he's clever about keeping distance from the actual pressure. And now he has a problem with me because I'm in the way of his brother's plan." "Yes," he looked at her steadily. "Miss Hadley, I want to be honest with you. I can investigate this. I can make it clear that I'm watching. But unless I catch someone in an actual criminal act, my options are limited." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not asking you to solve it. I'm giving you information because you should have it, and because if something more serious happens, I want there to already be a record of the pattern." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him processing that, the way she had come to recognize his silences as periods of genuine thought rather than blank uncertainty. "That's very practical," he said. "I try to be. Most people in this situation would be frightened." She looked at him directly. "I'm not most people." The slow burn of something she was not quite ready to name had been building in her since that first Saturday afternoon with the hinge plate. She was a person who examined her own reactions with the same methodical attention she gave to ironwork problems, and she had been examining this one carefully. She was attracted to Oliver Barker. That was a simple fact. He was a physically striking man, but that was not particularly the point. She had met handsome men before and felt nothing of consequence. What drew her was the way he paid attention, the way he came to the forge and watched her work without needing to interject, the way he asked questions that were real questions, not challenges dressed as questions, the way he had said, "That's smart," without a single note of surprise that it was coming from her. She was also, she told herself firmly, a woman who had come to Caldwell to build a business and a life, and who had no interest in the kind of complication that came from attaching herself to a man before she knew the ground she was standing on. She had seen what happened to women who made that mistake. She had seen women who were capable and competent allow themselves to be absorbed into someone else's story, their own skills gradually becoming background scenery for a man's narrative. She had no intention of being background scenery for anyone, so she watched him with interest and something warmer than interest, and she was careful, and she got back to work. December deepened, and the cold became serious. This was the kind of cold that the old-timers talked about, the Great Plains winter that settlers from the east consistently underestimated. The temperature was dropping below zero at night on a regular basis, and Jennie's forge was becoming not just a business but a genuine community resource, as people came in to have cold weather equipment repaired and to get warm. She always let them warm themselves near the forge without charge. It cost her nothing except a small amount of coal, and it bought her something that mattered more than money. It bought her a place in the community's sense of itself. She was also making a private decision about the forge structure that she did not advertise because she did not want to alarm anyone or invite criticism from people who would second-guess her professional judgment. She had been observing the limestone foundation of the existing forge building for 3 weeks, and she had concluded that it was fundamentally compromised in ways that Doyle's patch repairs had obscured but not fixed. The foundation was drawing moisture from the ground through the limestone, and in serious cold, that moisture would freeze and expand and put stress on the base columns that the building could not survive. She began quietly preparing for the eventuality. She laid in extra structural iron she claimed was for general stock. She identified which elements of the existing forge she could salvage if the structure failed. She mapped out in her head, and on paper, in a notebook she kept in her coat pocket, exactly what a rapid rebuild would require and in what sequence. She told no one about this because she had learned that when a woman in her profession predicted a structural problem, she was likely to be told she was worrying unnecessarily, and if she turned out to be right, the credit for her foresight went somewhere else. She would rather be correct quietly and deal with the consequences when they came. She was also dealing with the loneliness that she had mostly made her peace with but which the particular cold of a Kansas December made harder to ignore. She had Ruth Calloway's friendship, which was genuine and sustaining, and she had the satisfaction of good work, which was reliable in a way that few other things were. But there were evenings in the small room she rented above the boarding house when the wind was loud outside and the lamp was low, and she was aware in a way she did not usually let herself be of how long she had been traveling, and how much of her life was defined by the absence of things that other women had. She was not sorry for the path she had taken. She would not have been happy living a life that required her to fold her intelligence and her skill into a smaller shape than they naturally took. But she was human, and she was sometimes lonely, and on those evenings she occasionally thought about a man with gray eyes who watched her work with genuine attention and said, "That's smart," without any of the usual complications. Oliver Barker was having his own December complications, though Jennie did not know the details of them yet. He had been Marshal of Caldwell for 2 years, having taken the position after his predecessor resigned under circumstances that were complicated enough that most people in town avoided discussing them directly. Before Caldwell, he had been a deputy in Dodge City for 3 years, and before that he had done a year of cattle driving after coming west from Ohio at 22. He was 31 now, which meant he had been in Kansas for almost a decade and had the kind of deep familiarity with the place that came from choosing to stay somewhere rather than being born there. He liked Caldwell. He liked its difficulty and its edges, and the way it contained so many competing versions of what the future might look like. The farmers and the ranchers and the railroad interests and the merchants and the people who had been here before all of them, and were still navigating the complex injustices of what settlement had cost them. He felt he was useful here, and feeling useful was important to Oliver Barker in a way that went beyond professional satisfaction into something closer to identity. His complication in December was a man named Wade Harlan, who had come to Caldwell 2 months earlier and set himself up in a vague import and export operation that was, Oliver was increasingly certain, being used as a mechanism to move stolen livestock papers through the county. The operation was hidden carefully behind layers of legitimate-appearing business, and proving what Oliver suspected required more documentation than he currently had. Harlan was also, unfortunately, connected to Franklin Creed by way of a business arrangement that Oliver had not yet been able to fully map. This meant that the Creed problem and the Harlan problem were possibly the same problem, which made everything more complicated and more dangerous. He was thinking about this on a Wednesday evening when he found himself walking past the forge and seeing Jennie's light still burning inside. It was past 8 o'clock, which meant she had been working for more than 12 hours. He stopped at the open door. She worked with the door cracked even in cold weather because the forge drew air, and the temperature inside was dramatically different from outside and looked in. She was at the anvil, working a piece of iron in the lamplight with a focus so complete that she had not heard him approach. He watched her for a moment, genuinely struck by the picture she made, the way she moved with the metal, the precise economy of each hammer blow, the way she tilted her head to look at the angle of a curve with the same critical attention she gave to everything. There was iron dust on her face, and her dark hair was coming loose from its pins, and she looked entirely at home in a way that he realized he found deeply compelling. He knocked on the door frame, because it felt dishonest to watch her without her knowledge. She looked up without startling, and the expression on her face when she saw him went through several things very quickly: recognition, and then something warmer that she controlled into professional pleasantness before he could be certain of what he'd seen. "Marshal," she said. "Working late," he said. "Work that needs doing." She set down the hammer and moved the iron back to the fire to keep its heat. "Is there something you need, or are you just checking that I haven't burned the town down?" "Neither," he said. "I was walking past and I saw the light." He paused. "Can I ask you something that isn't about iron?" Something in her expression became attentive in a different way. "You can ask. Do you know a man named Wade Harlan?" She thought about it. "He came into the forge last week and asked about repair work on some freight hardware. I quoted him a price. He said he'd come back and he hasn't. What was your impression of him?" She considered the question the way she considered all questions, with genuine thoughtfulness rather than the reflex of saying whatever came first. He asked questions that didn't quite match what he claimed to need. He said the hardware was for freight wagons, but the questions he asked were about weight ratings for fixed storage structures, and he was looking around the forge more than he was looking at the hardware. She paused. "Why?" Oliver told her a version of what he was investigating, not everything because he was cautious by professional habit, but enough to explain his interest. He watched her process the information, saw the moment when she connected something. "The break-in at my coal storage," she said. "I thought of that too. Someone who knew about locks and coal quality. Someone who was also inside my forge looking around." "It's possible," he said. "I don't want to say more than I can support, but if he comes back, I'd appreciate knowing." "Of course," she said. Then, with the directness that he had come to expect from her, she added, "You could have sent word with a note or sent a deputy. You didn't have to come yourself." There was a pause in which the forge fire made a low sound and the cold outside pressed against the warm interior of the building, and Oliver Barker looked at Jennie Hadley and thought about several things he had been deliberately not thinking about for several weeks. "No," he said. "I could have done it either of those ways." He did not say anything else, and neither did she, but something in the quality of the silence between them had changed, and they were both aware of it. He left, and she stood for a moment after he was gone with her hands on the edge of the anvil, looking at the fire, before she picked up her hammer and went back to work. Harlan came back to the forge 3 days later, and this time Jennie was ready. She had thought carefully about what she wanted to learn and how to learn it without revealing what she was looking for. She gave him a thorough, professional tour of her capabilities, describing the work she could do in technical terms, mentioning the structural pieces she had done, referencing her railroad iron experience, and she watched where his attention went. It went to the forge structure itself. Specifically, to the chimney and the foundation, which he examined with an interest that had nothing to do with the freight hardware he claimed to need. When he left, she walked to Oliver Barker's office immediately. She laid out what she had observed with the clarity and precision she brought to all her analytical work, and she watched Oliver go very still in the way she had learned meant he was connecting things. "He's looking at the structural vulnerabilities," Oliver said. "Yes, and here's what I think that means." She leaned forward slightly. "The chimney draw on my forge shares a wall with the property immediately east. That's the building Sela's Creed has been trying to buy. If my forge structure fails, or is made to fail, it would likely damage the east wall of that property and potentially make the structure there uninhabitable." would force Abel Marsh to sell quickly at a reduced price. Oliver was staring at her. You worked that out. I've been watching that building's structural relationship to mine since I arrived. I drew up the original assessment. I know exactly what a failure in my forge would do to it. She paused. The interesting question is whether they're planning to cause the failure, or whether they're planning to take advantage of a natural failure that they might have some reason to anticipate. Natural failure, he said slowly. Like a cold weather structural collapse. The foundation here is limestone with serious moisture issues. In a hard freeze, she stopped. They may know something about this building's construction history that they've been keeping quiet. Doyle built the foundation himself, Oliver said, and Doyle's estate was managed by Franklin Creed because Doyle had no family. Creed would have had access to any records Doyle kept. They looked at each other across the desk. He knows the forge is going to fail in a hard freeze, Jennie said. He's been waiting for it, and using Harlan to make sure the timing works for his real estate plan. She sat back. I've been preparing for the structural failure for 2 weeks. I have salvage materials laid in. I have a rebuild plan ready. She said it very calmly. But I think you need to know what they're planning to do with the aftermath, because the collapse won't be the end of it. They'll try to move immediately before I can act. Oliver Barker looked at her with an expression that was no longer just respect or professional attention. It was the look of someone who was deeply, genuinely affected by what they were seeing. You planned 2 weeks ahead for your own forge collapsing, he said. I planned for the most likely serious failure scenario, she said. I didn't know anyone else was planning around it, but now that I do, I can factor that in. He was quiet for a long moment. Jennie, he said, and it was the first time he had used her first name, and they both noticed it. I've been doing this work for 5 years. I have never had someone walk into my office with a complete strategic analysis of their own situation and the opposing party's moves, built from direct professional observation, 3 weeks before anything actually happened. She felt something warm move through her that she was not going to examine at close range right now. Then you've been dealing with the wrong people, she said. He almost smiled. Apparently. The freeze came the second week of January, 1884, and it was everything the old-timers had been predicting and possibly worse. The temperature dropped to -14 on the night of January 10th, and Jennie had been watching the forge foundation for 2 days with the close attention of someone who knew what they were looking for. She was in the supply shed at 11:30 on Thursday night when she heard the first structural groan. She came out into the bitter cold and stood 40 feet back, watching. The forge went down in a cascade of ice-stressed metal and cracked limestone that was terrible and somewhat beautiful in the way that significant failures always were. The central chimney, which she had known was the critical weakness, failed first. Then the west wall bellowed outward. Then the roof structure, unsupported at its primary apex, collapsed straight down into the interior, and the whole thing went with a sound that she felt in her chest as much as she heard it. She stood in the snow with her jaw set and her dark eyes burning. Then she turned and went to the supply shed and started pulling out timber. Oliver Barker came around the corner of Main Street at a hard gallop on his roan, gelding 3 minutes after the collapse, drawn by the sound. He pulled up short when he saw her already in motion, already working, already 20 feet from the shed with a brace timber over one shoulder. She did not stop. "You going to help?" she said. "Or are you just going to sit up there on that horse and get frostbitten?" He swung down from the saddle so fast he barely remembered doing it. He tied the horse and came to her. "Tell me what you need," he said. She told him. She gave instructions with the clear, precise authority of someone who had been planning this moment for 2 weeks, and he followed them without question and without the counterproductive male instinct to second-guess or redirect. He moved the material she told him to move, held what she told him to hold, braced what she said needed bracing, and he watched her work in the lamplight and the bitter cold with an expression that had moved past shock into something he was not going to be able to walk back from. She was rebuilding. Not fully, not tonight, in negative temperatures with inadequate light and 2 people. But she was doing what mattered. She was securing the salvageable structural elements, protecting the equipment she could protect, creating the conditions under which a full rebuild was possible. She moved through the wreckage with knowledge so intimate it was almost eerie. She knew where the usable iron was, where the critical equipment had been positioned, what could be recovered and what was gone. She did not waste a single movement. At some point, an hour in, maybe more, she looked up from where she was working and found him watching her with an expression that she had not seen on any man's face before. Not admiration of the performed kind, not the assessment of someone tallying what she was worth. Something naked and honest, and complicated and very warm. She looked at him for a moment in the lantern light with snow in her hair and iron dust on her face and the cold pressing in from all sides. "You're going to freeze standing still," she said. "Grab the other end of this beam." He grabbed it. At 2 in the morning, she called the immediate work done. The forge was gone, but the critical salvage was completed. The equipment she could not afford to lose was secured and covered. The structural iron she would need for the rebuild was laid out where she could get to it efficiently. She was standing in the snow looking at the plan in her head when Oliver said, "Jennie, come inside." She looked at him. He was standing by his horse, and his expression was a careful combination of authority and uncertainty, which she found unexpectedly charming. "I'm almost done assessing. You can assess from inside where you won't get frostbite," he said. "I have a fire and coffee. The widow Calloway has a fire and tea if you'd rather, but you need to come in." She looked at the debris and at her mental checklist and decided that everything that needed doing tonight had been done. "Your office," she said, "is closer." They walked through the empty, frozen street together, the snow creaking under their boots. Inside the marshal's office, he stirred the stove and put the coffee pot on, and she sat in the chair across from his desk and opened her notebook and began writing down what she had salvaged and what she needed to order. She did this for 10 minutes while he moved around the office quietly, and then he set a mug of coffee in front of her without comment, and she looked up. He had sat down on the edge of his desk, which put him close to her but not crowding her, and he was looking at her with that unguarded expression that she was starting to understand she was going to have to deal with one way or another. "Say it," she said. "Say what?" "Whatever you've been working out how to say for the last 3 weeks. He was quiet for a moment. The stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved through Caldwell in the particular tone that -14 cold produces, which is lower and more serious than any other wind. "I have been," he admitted, "working out how to say it." "Then stop working it out and say it." He looked at her. "I've spent 2 years in this town feeling like I was ahead of most situations by enough to manage them. I'm good at this work. I see angles that other people miss. I'm not." He paused, and she could see the honesty cost him something, which made her respect it more. "I'm not saying that to brag. I'm saying it because I need you to understand what it means that I have watched you be 2 steps ahead of everything every time since the moment you arrived, including tonight. You had tonight planned 2 weeks ago." "Yes," she said. "That." He stopped. "I don't know how to explain what that does to me, except to say that it's not what I expected, and I cannot stop thinking about you. And I am aware that you came to this town to build something of your own, and I am not going to do anything to complicate that if you don't want me to." She sat for a moment with her coffee mug in both hands, feeling the warmth of it and looking at him with the same methodical attention she gave to problems she cared about solving. "Oliver," she said, and his name in her mouth felt like fitting a key to a lock. "I did come here to build something of my own. That is not negotiable. I will build my forge again. I will have it operational within 3 weeks, weather permitting, and I will expand it properly this time with a stone foundation that I will supervise every detail of. That is going to happen." "I know it will," he said. "What I'm trying to figure out," she said, "is whether a person can build something of their own and also have," she chose the word carefully, "company, in the real sense of the word. Not someone who will want to make decisions for her or who will be troubled by her being better at her work than most men in the county. Not someone who will want her to be smaller. I watched you rebuild a collapsed forge in a blizzard at midnight, he said quietly. I don't think I'm capable of seeing you as anything smaller than what you are. She looked at him for a long moment. The stove was warm. The coffee was strong. Outside, Caldwell was silent and frozen, and the debris of her forge was waiting for her to do exactly what she had said she would do. All right, she said. He blinked. All right. All right, you can have company. Don't make it strange by celebrating. He laughed, a genuine, surprised laugh that she decided she liked the sound of considerably, and she looked down at her notebook so he wouldn't see what her face was doing. Now she had to deal with the Creeds. The morning after the collapse, before she had eaten breakfast or dealt with the half-dozen people who came by the forge debris to look and to offer sympathy of varying degrees of sincerity, Jennie went to Abel Marsh's house and knocked on his door. Abel Marsh was a quiet man of 60 who had made money in land and had the wisdom to know that his best income came from renting to capable people rather than managing things himself. He answered the door in his morning coat and looked at her with obvious concern. "Miss Hadley," he said, "I heard last night. I'm terribly sorry, thank you," she said. "My lease is still valid. The property is still viable. I want to begin the rebuild immediately, and I want to know if you've had any approach from Franklin or Silas Creed about the property since the collapse." He blinked. Then his expression became something more careful. "Franklin Creed did send a boy around at 7 this morning with a note," he said slowly, "offering to buy. Yes. At a reduced price, I imagine, citing the structural failure and the ongoing cold weather." Abel Marsh stared at her. "He offered 40% of what he offered me 6 months ago. He's been planning this," she said. "He's been waiting for the forge to fail because he knew it would fail. He had access to Doyle's construction records through the estate, and he knew the foundation was bad. He's been waiting for a hard winter." She met the older man's eyes. "I need you to decline his offer. And I need you to send me any documentation you have of this morning's approach, because Marshal Barker is building a case against Creed that includes fraud and possible conspiracy, and this morning's letter is evidence of knowledge of the failure before it was publicly known." Abel Marsh was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll write a reply to Creed's letter declining, and I'll make a copy of it for you. And I'll look out whatever correspondence I have from him going back to last year." "Thank you," she said. "You won't regret it." She went from Marsh's house to Oliver's office, arriving at the same time he was coming back from his own early morning. He had clearly not slept much either, and she was momentarily struck by how he looked in daylight after everything that had happened in the night, tired and steady, and something else that she registered and filed away. She gave him the information about Marsh and the letter before he could say anything personal, which she did partly for efficiency, and partly because she was still calibrating the new territory they had entered and preferred to be standing on solid professional ground while she did it. He took the information with the same focused attention he always gave her, and then he said, "Harlan left town this morning. I found out when I went to his lodgings at 6. She felt the shape of the problem shift. "He did what he was here to do," she said. "The collapse happened. He reported back to whoever sent him. Which means Creed knows we're likely to start making connections." Oliver's expression was grim. "I need to move faster than I planned." "What do you need from me?" He shook his head. "This part is my work. I have a deputy I've been keeping out of the main situation for exactly this reason. He goes to the county seat today with everything I have, and we let the county sheriff's office handle the legal process from there while I keep an eye on things here." He paused. "Jennie, you need to focus on the rebuild." "I know," she said. "I intend to." "I mean," he chose his words carefully, "I don't want you to feel that you have to manage this situation when you have enough on your hands." She looked at him. "I appreciate that. But managing several things at once is something I do fairly well." "I know you do." He almost smiled. "I'm just trying to be useful." "You are useful," she said. "You're very useful. Now go send your deputy and let me go figure out what I'm ordering from the iron merchant." The rebuild was the hardest and most satisfying work she had done in her professional life. She had 3 weeks before the weather broke enough to work outside reliably, and she used every hour of those 3 weeks. She spent the first week in the cold. It never quite broke zero during those days, and she worked with her hands in heavy gloves, which required adjustments to her technique that she had to improvise on the fly, doing structural assessment and salvage. Oliver came every evening after his duties were done and worked alongside her without being asked, and they developed a working rhythm together that was entirely natural, the kind of synchrony that takes most people years to achieve. He did not try to take over. He did not offer advice she hadn't requested. He watched. He did what was needed, and occasionally she would explain something and he would ask the right questions, and she would find herself talking about iron and structure in the way she had only ever talked with her father, with genuine intellectual excitement, rather than the careful calibrations of someone explaining themselves to a skeptical audience. The temperature differential between the interior of the forge and the outside creates stress on any material that crosses that boundary, she told him one evening, drawing a quick diagram in the frost on a flat board with her finger. So the wall structure can't be uniform. You have to account for expansion and contraction. The reason Doyle's foundation failed wasn't just the moisture. It was that he used the same material across the whole base without accounting for the temperature gradient. Oliver was crouched next to her, looking at the diagram. So you need different materials at different points. Or you need to design the structure so the expansion is directed rather than random. You give it places to move that won't damage anything critical. The iron can expand 0.06 of an inch per foot per 10 degrees in a 50-degree change across a 20-foot wall. That's more than a finger's width. If it has nowhere to go, it finds its own way. He looked at her diagram, then at her. "You're talking about giving the building permission to breathe," he said. She blinked. That was not a translation she had heard before, but it was exactly right. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." He smiled at her, and in the cold night air with frost everywhere and the work half done around them, she felt something large and warm settle into her chest with the kind of rightness that she associated with a piece of iron coming out of the forge at exactly the correct temperature, that moment of perfect readiness. She did not say anything romantic. She said, "Help me move that beam." He got up and helped her move the beam, and she was smiling at the wood while she worked, and she knew he couldn't see it, and she was glad. Oliver's deputy returned from the county seat on the 12th day with authorization for a full investigation of Franklin Creed and his business associates, including Harlan. The county sheriff's office sent 2 investigators. Oliver handled the coordination in Caldwell with the steady, methodical competence that characterized everything Jennie had seen him do. Creed, when confronted with the documentation, including the letter to Abel Marsh, the evidence of the lock tampering, and several business records that the county investigators found in Harlan's abandoned lodgings that had not been as thoroughly cleared as Harlan had perhaps thought, folded faster than Jennie had expected. He tried to make it about Harlan. He claimed that Harlan had acted independently, that the plan to compromise Jennie's forge had been Harlan's idea, that his own letter to Marsh that morning was simply opportunistic real estate interest. The investigators were not impressed. Enough of the documentation connected Creed directly to the plan, specifically a series of letters between Creed and Harlan that predated Jennie's arrival in Caldwell and referenced the forge properties, structural timeline, which was a phrase that required specific knowledge of the foundation failure that could only have come from the Doyle estate records Creed had access to. Creed and his brother Silas were indicted in February. Harlan was located in Wichita 3 weeks later and brought back to face his own accounting. Oliver handled all of it with the quiet, thorough professionalism that Jennie had come to understand was central to who he was, not dramatic, not performative, just deeply reliable. The forge rebuild began in earnest the 3rd week of January when the temperature broke to above zero and stayed there. Jennie had her stone foundation materials ready, and she supervised every detail of the foundation work with the focused intensity she had brought to everything else. She hired 2 men from town to do the heavy hauling. Both of them came highly recommended by Ruth Calloway, which was the only recommendation Jennie trusted at this point, and she did all the skilled work herself. Oliver was there on the day the first stone course went in, watching with the particular expression she had come to think of as his paying attention face, slightly narrowed eyes, weight shifted forward, completely present. He was not on duty. He had come because he wanted to be there. She was working with the mason who was laying the stone, checking the level and the drainage slope she had designed into the base. Oliver watched her make a correction to the placement of a key stone, a precisely calculated adjustment that changed the angle of the course by 2 degrees, and she heard him say, quietly to himself more than to her, "There it is." She looked at him over her shoulder. "What?" He shook his head, but there was something in his face that was open and warm and unguarded in a way that she was learning he only was around her. "Nothing," he said. "Just watching you work." She turned back to the foundation. She was, she realized, happy. Not contentedly settled or professionally satisfied, but genuinely, specifically happy with the work in her hands and the cold air and the person behind her who watched her with eyes that saw all of her and found what they saw worth staying for. The new forge was operational by the second week of February. It was substantially better than the old one. The foundation was sound. The chimney draw was correctly calculated. The wall structure incorporated the design principles she had worked out after the collapse. She had also, in the rebuild, made a series of improvements to the layout that improved her efficiency significantly. The new forge was a professional ironworker's space, not a patched-up inheritance from a careless predecessor. The day she fired it for the first time, Ruth Calloway brought pie and Oliver brought a bottle of decent whiskey, and the 3 of them stood outside the new forge in the February cold while it came up to temperature, listening to the sound of it. "Sounds different," Oliver said. "Better draw," Jennie said. "The chimney pull is about 30% stronger than the old one. You can hear it, the tone is lower." He listened, head slightly tilted, and she watched him hear what she was describing the moment when it landed for him. "It does sound lower," he said, and he was smiling. Ruth was looking at them both with the expression of a woman who had made several accurate assessments of the situation and was declining to say any of them out loud. She raised her coffee cup. "To the new forge," she said. "To the new forge," Jennie agreed. Oliver raised the whiskey bottle. "And to the woman who built it." Jennie looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, a real smile. Not the professional pleasantness but the real thing, which she did not give out carelessly, and took the whiskey bottle from his hand and had a drink from it. Ruth definitely saw that, and the expression on her face became even more accurately assessed. February turned to March, and March brought wind and the first suggestion of warmth coming eventually, and Caldwell settled into the particular rhythm of a frontier town in early spring, busy, purposeful, full of energy that had been waiting out the winter. Jennie's forge was busy from the first week it was open, busier than the old one had been at its best, because she was now not only doing the regular trade but also taking on structural ironwork commissions for 3 buildings that were going up in the spring. She was also, with some care and thought, navigating the territory of what she and Oliver were to each other. They had not made declarations. She had not asked for them and he had not offered them. What they had was an accumulating weight of shared evenings and working conversation, and the kind of silences that mean something different from empty space. He came to the forge most evenings when he was not on duty. They walked sometimes along the edge of town in the late afternoon light, which came earlier now and had a quality she associated with genuine hope. He told her things about himself, his family in Ohio, his reasons for coming west, the complexity of the work he did, and the weight of the judgments it sometimes required. She told him things she did not usually tell people, what ironwork felt like from the inside, the way her father had taught her, the specific loneliness of being exceptionally good at something that the world had decided was not for you. He listened to all of it with the same complete attention he had given her since the first afternoon she had met him, and there was nothing in his face during any of it that was anything other than genuine interest and genuine care. One evening in late March, they were walking along the creek south of town, where the ice was finally breaking up. The air was cold but not brutal, and the light was that particular gold color that only exists in Kansas at the end of a winter that has lasted too long. They had been talking about something practical, the structural commission for the new bank building, and then they had stopped talking, and they were simply walking together along the water. He stopped and she stopped. She looked at him. "I need to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said, which was exactly what she had said in the office in January, and they both recognized it. He started and then stopped, and she could see him trying to find the right shape for something that did not have a standard form. "I've been very careful," he said, "not to assume, not to crowd your space or your work or your sense of who you are. I know that matters to you and it should matter, and I don't want to be someone who—" "Oliver," she said. He stopped. "I know what you're trying not to do," she said. "I've been watching you be careful about it since January. And I want you to know," she paused, because she was choosing her words as carefully as he was. "I see it. I see that you're trying to leave room for me to be exactly who I am. And I want you to know that the reason I haven't said anything about it is not because I don't feel the same way. It's because I needed to be sure that I wasn't making a decision from a place of," she found the right word, "gratitude or relief, because you were kind when other people weren't. And now," he said, his voice was very quiet. "And now I've watched you for 3 months," she said. "And I've learned that you are the same in every situation, when you're doing your work and when you're not, when I'm impressive and when I'm just doing ordinary things, when you're tired and when you're not. You're the same all the way through." She met his eyes. "That's not something I take lightly." He reached out and took her hand, which was the first time he had done that, and she looked down at their joined hands for a moment, hers still marked by the work, the calluses and the small scars of iron and fire, and then she looked up at him. "Jennie," he said. "Yes," she said, and she meant it in every sense it could be meant. He kissed her beside the creek in the March light, and it was exactly what she had known it would be, careful and thorough and honest all the way through, no performance in it, just the genuine gravity of someone who had thought carefully about this and meant every part of it. When they broke apart, the creek was making its early spring sound beside them, ice and water together. "I've been thinking about asking you something," he said, "but I wanted to wait until you'd rebuilt the forge." "Why?" "Because I wanted you to know that the asking comes after you've done what you came here to do, not before. So you'd know it wasn't," he paused, "conditional on anything." She understood immediately. He was making sure she knew that he was not asking her to trade her independence for what he was offering. He was asking because the independence was already established. "That's very thoughtful," she said. "I can be thoughtful," he said, with a slight edge of mock defensiveness that made her laugh. She laughed there beside the spring creek, with his hand still warm around hers. She could not recall the last time she had laughed like that, freely, without calculation. "Ask then," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "With the understanding that you are always the best ironworker in any room you walk into, and that your forge is yours and always will be, and that I would like to spend the rest of my life learning what iron does that I don't know yet." She looked at him for a long moment. The gold light was everywhere. The creek moved. "Yes," she said, "with the understanding that you will never stand in my way." "Never," he said, "and that I will sometimes get iron dust on everything." "I've noticed," he said. "I don't mind," she squeezed his hand. "Then yes." They were married in April of 1884, in the small white church on the north end of Caldwell's Main Street, with Ruth Calloway standing up with Jennie and Oliver's deputy, a young man named Thomas, standing up with Oliver. It was a practical ceremony conducted by a Methodist minister, who was also a practical man, and who appreciated the directness with which both parties stated their vows. Jennie wore a deep blue dress that Ruth had helped her make, and that she had pressed and hung carefully for a week beforehand, and she wore her hair up in a way that was more elaborate than her usual working style, with small iron pins she had made herself. A piece of vanity she allowed herself, because she liked the idea of wearing her own work even to her own wedding. Oliver looked at her when she came down the short aisle, and she saw his face do the thing it had done at the forge on that first working morning. That open, struck expression of someone encountering something that exceeded expectation. She walked to him with the same measured confidence she walked into every situation, and when she reached him and stood beside him and felt his hand find hers, she felt the same rightness she had felt beside the creek in March, the sensation of a thing coming into its proper place. Franklin Creed was not at the wedding. He was in the process of being formally prosecuted at the county seat, and Silas Creed had left Caldwell for parts unknown in the wake of the investigation, and Harlan was facing his own legal consequences. None of the people who had tried to use the forge's collapse to build something at Jennie's expense were anywhere near Caldwell on the day she married Oliver Barker. She noted this with quiet satisfaction and said nothing about it. They had a small celebration at Ruth Calloway's boarding house after the ceremony, with about 30 people from town who had found their way to genuine respect for Jennie in the months since her arrival. Abel Marsh gave a short and rather moving toast about competence being the only introduction a person needed. Thomas, Oliver's deputy, gave a longer and less polished toast that was nonetheless sincere. Ruth said nothing formal but brought out a second pie, which was its own kind of statement. Jennie and Oliver moved into the house on the west side of town that Oliver had been renting, a reasonable house, 2 rooms and a good kitchen, with a yard that was large enough to be useful. Jennie looked at the yard and saw immediately where she would put the additional supply storage that she was going to need as the forge work expanded, and she said so, and Oliver said, "I thought you might. I've been leaving that corner clear." And she looked at him and felt the warmth of being understood with such precision by someone who had been thinking about her needs without being asked. The spring and summer of 1884 were a period of expansion for both of them, in the literal and figurative sense. Jennie took on the bank building commission and 2 others, and her structural ironwork began developing a reputation that spread beyond Caldwell into the surrounding county. She hired an assistant, a young man of 20 named Samuel, who was genuinely interested in the work, and whom she began teaching with the same serious intention her father had brought to teaching her. She also began thinking about what a larger facility might look like, which was a conversation she had with Oliver over supper one evening. "I'd need to expand north," she said, with the plans she'd sketched spread out on the table. "The forge space is adequate for individual commissions, but if I want to take on larger structural work, I need more floor space and a second forge capability." Oliver looked at the plans, which were detailed and technically precise, the kind of thing a trained architect would have produced. "Abel Marsh owns the land immediately north," he said. "I know, I need to talk to him. He'll be fair." Oliver paused. "Jennie, this is significant growth. Is this what you want to do?" She looked at him. "Yes. Is that a problem?" "God, no," he said, with a directness that she appreciated. "I'm asking because I want to understand what you need, not because I'm questioning it." She looked at her plans. "I came here to build something," she said. "I'm not done yet." He put his hand over hers on the table, warm and sure. "I know," he said. "Tell me what you need." She told him, and he listened. And in the morning he went and had a preliminary conversation with Abel Marsh on her behalf, not negotiating, because she would do that herself, but clearing the ground so the conversation could happen quickly, and without the social friction that sometimes slowed things down when a woman was the one initiating a major business negotiation. It was a fine line, the line between support and interference, and she had told him where it was, and he walked it with care. The negotiation with Abel Marsh went smoothly, largely because Jennie had spent several days preparing for every likely variation of it, and knew exactly what she was willing to pay and what she was not. By October of 1884, construction had begun on the expanded forge. It was real construction this time, with a proper stone and brick foundation that Jennie had designed herself, and that several people who saw the blueprints commented upon with genuine admiration. She supervised every detail of the construction, the way she supervised everything, with total knowledge of what she was looking for, and no patience for work that didn't meet the standard. Oliver came by the construction site on a Tuesday afternoon and stood watching her correct a mason's error, a slight misalignment in the second course that would have compounded over 20 more courses into a significant structural problem, with the calm, specific authority she always used when correcting skilled workers. She did not belittle. She explained exactly what was wrong and why, and what it needed to be instead. The mason, a man she had worked with on the original rebuild, nodded and corrected it without argument because he had learned over several months that when Jennie Hadley said something was wrong, it was wrong, and her corrections were always precisely right. Oliver watched this with his arms crossed and a look that she had come to understand, over 9 months of marriage, as the look he got when he was feeling something large that he was savoring quietly. When she came to him at the edge of the site, he said without preamble, "You're going to teach here, aren't you?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "In this space," he said. "Eventually, not just Samuel, more people." He looked at the construction. "It's big enough. You're designing space you don't need for your current work." She looked at him for a long moment. She had been thinking about this for a while, the way her father had taught her, the way knowledge of ironwork was not being transmitted to the next generation in the way it needed to be as the frontier settled into permanence and needed competent craftspeople rather than improvisers. She had not said anything to Oliver about it because she was still working out whether it was a practical idea or a fantasy. "How long have you been thinking that?" she said. "Since I saw the plans," he said. "There's more space here than you need for 2 forges and supply storage. I didn't say anything because I thought you'd tell me when you were ready to." She looked at the construction site and at the plans in her head and at her husband, who knew her well enough to see the shape of something she hadn't said out loud. "It might not be practical," she said. "Tell me why or why not," she told him. The conversation lasted until the light was gone and the mason had long since gone home. And by the end of it, the idea had gone from a vague possibility into something with enough specific shape that she could work with it. In November of 1884, she discovered she was pregnant. She sat with this information for 2 days before she told Oliver, not because she was uncertain about telling him, but because she wanted to think clearly about what it meant and what she intended before she was in the middle of a conversation about it. She thought about her mother, who had been a capable and intelligent woman who had disappeared slowly into the business of having children and managing a household in ways that had seemed natural at the time, and that Jennie now understood had cost her something real. She thought about what she needed from Oliver and whether it was something he could give. On the 3rd day, she told him. He was very still for a moment, and then his face did something complex and warm that moved through several things before settling into an expression she had not seen before, something like wonder but grounded, not floating. He looked at her carefully. "How are you feeling about it?" he said, which was the right first question. "I'm thinking about what I need to make sure doesn't change," she said. "Tell me." "The forge, the teaching plan, my work." She met his eyes. "I've watched women lose themselves in this, Oliver. I don't intend to." "I know," he said. "And I'm going to say something now that I mean completely, so I need you to hear it as completely as I mean it. Your work is not going to stop because we're having a child. We will figure out what needs to be figured out. I will do whatever needs doing on my side, but your work is not negotiable and it's not something I would ever want you to give up." She looked at him for a long time. "You mean that?" "Entirely," he said. She nodded once, which was her version of letting something land without making too much of it. Then she said, "I'm going to need to adjust the construction timeline slightly for the spring." "Tell me what you need," he said, and that was the same thing he had said in March when she was planning the expansion, and she felt the continuity of it, the pattern of him being the same all the way through, in every situation, just as she had told him beside the creek. Their son was born in June of 1885, in the room above the boarding house where Ruth Calloway had lived for 20 years, because Ruth had insisted on being nearby, and Ruth's insistence was not something either of them had any interest in overcoming. He was a healthy, solid baby who came into the world with a look of serious attention on his face that Oliver said was his mother's expression to the letter, and Jennie said was simply the appropriate response to arriving somewhere new and needing to assess the situation. They named him Henry for her father. Ruth wept, which she did very quietly and then entirely denied. Oliver held his son with the careful, present attention he brought to everything that mattered, and looked at Jennie over the baby's head with an expression that was so full of things she could barely look at it without feeling like she was standing next to the forge at full temperature. "All right," he said. "All right," she said, meaning it completely. The expanded forge opened in September of 1885. It was, by any honest assessment, a remarkable facility, the best ironworking shop in the county and possibly in several counties around it. The second forge gave Jennie the capacity to take on multiple large commissions simultaneously, which she immediately did. Samuel had become a genuinely skilled assistant over the course of his training, and she hired 2 additional workers as the work expanded, both of whom she trained personally in the methods she had developed. The teaching program began informally in the winter of 1885 and became formal the following spring. She had 4 apprentices by the end of 1886, 2 of them women, a development that caused some discussion in Caldwell, most of it eventually positive, particularly after both women demonstrated that Jennie's training produced results. One of the women, a girl of 19 named Clara who had grown up on a farm and had the kind of physical intelligence that Jennie recognized immediately, showed the same innate feeling for iron that Jennie's father had recognized in her. Jennie poured into Clara's training everything she knew, with the same generosity her father had shown her. Oliver's career continued to develop as well. He was offered a federal marshalling position in 1886, which would have required moving and which he declined without discussing it with Jennie first. When she found out about the offer not from him, but from Thomas, who mentioned it in passing and immediately realized from her expression that he had said something he perhaps should not have, she went home and found Oliver at his desk and put her hands on the table and looked at him. "The federal position," she said. He met her eyes without flinching. "I turned it down, without talking to me." "Yes, Oliver," she was working to keep her voice level. "I am not a thing that keeps you from opportunity. I am your wife. You talk to me about your decisions." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him taking her point with genuine care rather than defensiveness. "You're right," he said. "I made an assumption about your answer and used it to skip the conversation. That wasn't fair." "No," she said. "It wasn't. What was your assumption?" "That you wouldn't want to uproot everything, the forge, the teaching program, the apprentices, and that I didn't want you to have to, and that the position wasn't worth it." She looked at him for a long moment. "Was it a good position?" "Good work, yes, but Caldwell is where I want to be. I don't need a federal badge to do good work." "Would you like me to tell you what I actually think, now that we're actually having the conversation?" "Very much," he said. "I think you made a reasonable assessment of my preferences, but you owed me the chance to make it myself. I think I would have said exactly what you decided, that Caldwell is where I've built something and I'm not done building it. But I want to be the one who says it." She paused. "And I want you to know that if there is ever a position that you genuinely want that requires moving, we talk about it. We don't assume." "Agreed," he said. "Fully and genuinely agreed. And I'm sorry." "I know you are," she said. And she sat down across from him and they talked about it properly, all of it. The way they had learned to talk about everything with the fullness of 2 people who took each other seriously. In the spring of 1887, Henry, who was nearly 2, developed the habit of appearing at the forge at every opportunity, having worked out that if he was present and quiet long enough he might eventually be allowed to touch something. He sat on a stool with the patient intensity of a small person who has decided what they want and is prepared to wait for it. Jennie watched him watch the fire with a look that was familiar to her from the inside, and she thought of her father, and she thought of Clara, and she thought about what it meant to pass something forward. She made Henry a small toy hammer of carefully wrought iron with a smooth wooden handle that she fitted to the size of a 2-year-old's hand, and the afternoon she gave it to him, and he held it and looked at it with that serious, evaluating attention. Oliver was standing in the forge doorway watching, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed saying. Franklin Creed's prosecution concluded in 1886 with a conviction on fraud charges and a significant fine. He did not return to Caldwell. Silas Creed was located and prosecuted separately and also convicted. Harlan spent 2 years in the county jail. The buildings and properties that the Creed operation had been targeting were purchased by their actual intended owners or developed by people who had been waiting for the pressure to lift. The widow whose latch Jennie had modified bought a small additional parcel of land next to her property and expanded her kitchen garden into something genuinely productive. Oliver noted on a quiet evening in September of 1887 that the town felt different than it had 3 years earlier. Less like something pressing down on it, he said. Jennie was nursing their second son, born that July, whom they had named James, and she looked up from the infant and considered the question with her usual seriousness. It was always going to get better, she said. Places like this, they're being decided. Which version of themselves they're going to be. Caldwell was deciding and the wrong people were winning for a while. And now the right people are winning, she said simply. He smiled at her. You're one of the right people. Obviously, she said, and he laughed. James was different from Henry in almost every way. Where Henry was methodical and observing, James was immediate and energetic, constantly in motion, climbing everything, investigating everything with his hands before his eyes. Oliver said he was going to be either a very good cattleman or a very troublesome deputy, and Jennie said he was going to be whatever he decided to be when he was old enough to decide. The forge, as 1888 approached, was genuinely one of the institutions of Caldwell, not just a business but a place that had shaped the town's capacity. 3 of Jennie's apprentices had gone on to establish their own smithies in nearby towns, taking with them the methods she had taught them. 2 of the original 4 remained in Caldwell, working with her in the expanded facility. Clara had become so skilled that Jennie was already thinking about what it would mean to offer her a partnership stake in the business. Ruth Calloway, who had been watching all of this unfold with the satisfaction of someone who had made several accurate assessments very early on, came to the forge one afternoon in October of 1888 and sat on the stool that had been Henry's station for 2 years. He had graduated from stool sitting to actual instruction, and at 3½ was learning to identify metals by their color in the fire, which was further than most adults got, and said, "I want to ask you something." Jennie was doing finish work on a decorative commission which was detail-focused enough that she could talk while she did it. "Ask," she said. "Are you happy?" Ruth said. Jennie considered the question with the same care she gave to all serious questions. She looked at the forge, which was warm and bright and running at full capacity with 2 workers at the second forge doing quality work. She thought about Henry with his little iron hammer and James climbing the fence post in the yard and Oliver at his desk going over papers with the steady attention he gave to everything, and the conversations over supper that moved from practical to philosophical and back again with the ease of people who had been thinking together for years. "Yes," she said. "Simply yes," Ruth said. "Simply yes," Jennie said. "It's enough." Ruth nodded, apparently satisfied. "I'm glad," she said. "I thought you would be. I thought you would find a way to make it work. I thought so the first day you drove past and didn't slow down when Creed tried to stop you. Jennie looked at her with a slight smile. Was I that obvious? You were that determined, Ruth said. Determination like that, it either burns everything down or it builds something extraordinary. I'm glad it went the second way. Jennie set down her tools for a moment. Did you have doubts about which way it would go? Ruth considered this. About you, no, about whether the world would cooperate, always. She paused. But it helped, I think, that you found someone worth cooperating with. Jennie thought about Oliver coming around the corner on his roan, gelding the night the forge collapsed, stopping short at the sight of her already in motion, getting down from the saddle without a word, and asking only what she needed. She thought about him in the cold, working alongside her without interference, learning the shape of her plans and following them without trying to redirect them. She thought about every evening since, the accumulation of shared time that had become the structure of her life, not a cage but a foundation, the kind that was designed to give the building room to breathe. It helped significantly, she said. She picked up her tools and went back to the finish work, and Ruth sat for a while longer watching the forge do what forges do, take raw material that cannot shape itself and transform it, in heat and controlled force, and the hands of someone who knows what they're doing, into something that will last. Oliver came by the forge that evening, as he did most evenings, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her finish the decorative piece. The light in the forge was warm and gold, and the sound of the fire was steady. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, as a particular quality of presence, the way you become aware of the right temperature of iron by feel rather than sight. She held up the finished piece, a scroll-worked bracket with her particular style of detailed line work, and tilted it in the forge light. Good, Oliver said from the doorway. Good, she said. He came in and looked at it properly, tracing the line of the scroll with one finger the way she had shown him iron responds to touch. It's beautiful, he said. The client wanted something that would last a generation, she said. He handed it back to her. He was looking at her with that expression, the one she had given up trying to describe with precision, because the precision was not the point. I think you've been making things that last a generation since you arrived here, he said. She put the bracket down on the cooling rack and looked at him. We've been making things that last, she said. Not just me. He crossed the forge floor and she met him halfway, which was the way they did most things, neither waiting for the other, both moving, arriving at the same place at the same time. He kissed her in the warm light of the forge she had built and rebuilt and expanded, with iron cooling around them, and the work of the day settling into the permanence of finished things. And she put her hands against his chest, and felt his heartbeat, and thought that this was what she had never quite let herself plan for, because planning for it seemed like asking too much, not just the work, but someone to stand in the warmth of it with her. Someone who saw the whole of her and stayed because of what he saw. Not in spite of it. Outside, Caldwell went about its evening. The street was quiet. The cold of January 1884 was long past, and the forge was warm, and Henry Hadley Barker, aged 3.5, had fallen asleep in the small corner they kept clear for him with his iron toy hammer still in his hand. And James Hadley Barker, 4 months old, was in Ruth Calloway's capable arms 2 blocks north while his parents had a working evening, and Clara was banking the second forge for the night with the efficient competence of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Everything that had been broken had been rebuilt. Everything that had been cold was warm now. Everything that had been uncertain had resolved into the solid, enduring shape of a life made deliberately, with knowledge and intention, and the particular kind of courage that is not the absence of fear, but the decision that the work matters more. Jennie Hadley Jennie Barker, though she signed her ironwork with both names and always would, had come to Caldwell to build something. She had built considerably more than she planned, and she was not remotely finished. The forge fire burned low and steady in the February evening, and the iron on the cooling rack ticked as it settled into its final form, and Oliver Barker, Marshal of Caldwell, stood in the forge his wife had rebuilt from a collapse in the cold, and he was exactly where he wanted to be, with exactly who he wanted to be with, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.